Demons are a concept in most major religions, being a bit of a stranger notion, malicious evil spirits which roam about, causing issues and suffering, tempting people into sin, attacking, possessing, haunting, and all around just being a bit of a nuisance. Naturally, Judaism, too, has quite a bit to say about this topic, although there are variations of this notion of demons, or shadim, as they're referred to in the old texts, do vary somewhat, be it in purpose, nature, looks, actions, and otherwise. The good news, however, is there is actually a massive amount of information on them spread throughout many of the older texts, books like the Talmud and their commentaries. In occasional broken-off tangents, they discuss types of demons, different specific prominent ones, what they look like, what they do, and how one could take precautions to avoid them. And also, of course, there is a pretty simple, yet moderately disgusting method described that one could use to summon a demon, which I absolutely do not recommend, so I'll get to that towards the end, so stick around for that. So, with that said, let's get straight into it. The first real mention of demons, again, shadim, is in the first book of the Talmud, Tractate Brachos. To be fair, the Talmud isn't really so chronological and is sorted by subject, but this is first, and it gives a pretty general understanding as to what we're dealing with here. First and foremost, they're described as being invisible most of the time, and generally rather small, although they could be many sizes, with thousands of them surrounding you at every moment. They cause issues for a person of all sort, be it causing you to feel claustrophobic, tired, pained, or even that they can wear out your clothes. Elsewhere, it's explained that demons are similar to angels in 3 ways, and similar to humans in 3 ways. They're akin to angels in that they have wings, they fly all around the world, and that they know the future. Although, it does say that they know the future not because they're told, but because they secretly listen in, whatever that means. As for how they're similar to people, they eat and drink like people, they reproduce like people, and they die like people. So, that's quite a bit of detail on them right there. Loosely, they're essentially described as a more spiritual, yet not entirely so, entity, being winged creatures who know the future to some extent, yet still eat, drink, and die just like the rest of us. There's also a bit more detail as to what precisely they look like. For one thing, they all seem to have the feet of a rooster. That's one of the only ones that's pretty much an absolute given, as you'll see later. There are stories where certain people's decisions are reliant on them having rooster legs, and in fact, it says that if you ever want to know if a demon is skulking around your room at night, you should pour ashes around your bed and check for rooster prints. So, that's another detail. As for what else they look like, it can really vary. One source posits that they have the heads of a goat, and those ones usually haunt the inside of lavatories. Another story speaks of a demon with 7 heads, each of which was the head of a serpent. But generally speaking, they seem to be moderately humanoid, which can be seen in how they came to be. One thing that's definitely mentioned, however, is that they're malleable and can change their form and shape at will. There are points of this notion as to how demons were created. Most sources mention that they were born from Adam in the years after his sin of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. This, in turn, would tie itself to a more mysterious figure referenced very rarely in these texts of a female-like creature referred to as Lilith, the mother of demons, who had something to do with this whole situation with Adam. Yet another source mentions that an amount of demons were spawned at the Tower of Babel when it was destroyed, and a large portion of those atop it descended afterwards as demonkind. According to some others, they were created right after the 6th day of creation, just before the 7th day started, among quite a few other unique things, like the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the first rainbow, the burial place of Moshe, and others. By the way, as a brief aside, in case you're wondering why these are being discussed in the Talmud in the first place, which is essentially a massive legal text, A, the Talmud does get sidetracked onto some very random tangent very often, and B, apparently it sometimes does have some bearing on legal rulings, such as, what if you can't hear somebody calling out to you, somebody that you can't see very well, and they tell you to give a divorce document to their wife? Well, as you can't really see them so well, there's a concern that perhaps it's a demon speaking to you, in which case you wouldn't be able to deliver this document. This gets discussed further in a later tractate that deals with the laws of divorce, in a briefly discussed case, and consensus is reached that you can't trust it even if you see its shadow, as demons could cast a shadow. Rather, you'll know that it's a real person if it has the shadow of a shadow, which a demon can't imitate. So I guess that's important to bear in mind for some reason. In fact, this lends itself more into a general point about the nature of demons in Judaism. See, demons are a bit unique here because they're discussed in an almost casual tone, more akin to a daily nuisance like a wild animal to avoid, more than a malicious, malignant entity. Which, mind you, they still very well could be to some extent, but more generally speaking, demons in Judaism really just aren't that bad. From what I've seen, they usually don't really have any mentions whatsoever as to bearing any association with hell, or Gehenna as it's called in Judaism, although, to be fair, that functions completely differently here too. Got a video on that also if you're interested. They just sort of exist as usually kind of annoying creatures to be avoided if it's not one of the worst ones. Now, there are some worse ones, which in some cases have quite literally overthrown kings, but broadly speaking, they aren't too big of a deal. Interestingly, there's a demon language mentioned that apparently could be learned. In fact, it's mentioned that some people learnt this, and it was considered a more advanced scholarly form of learning. We don't know much of their language, but we might know one word, which I'll get to in a second. There are also some specific major demons mentioned. There's Kordiakus, a demon which causes madness in a person who drinks new wine. There's Shabriri, which affects pools of water that were left out overnight and causes blindness, and I'm pretty sure this is referenced in Elden Ring, but I'm not 100% certain. There's the demon Meriri, which is said to be an unholy amalgamation of eyes. There's Agrat, daughter of Machalat, who patrols at nightfall on some days of the week with an entourage of tens of thousands of angels of destruction. She's actually kind of a chiller and chats with some of the people who she was told not to harm. Then there's Horman, son of Lilith, where there's a story mentioned about him running along the walls of the city of Mechoza, and they tried to chase after him, but he was too fast. Then he had 2 mules set up on 2 bridges on either side of a particular river, and leapt between the 2 donkeys on the bridges while holding 2 cups of wine and pouring the cups into one another while not spilling a drop, in order to summon massive storms. So the royal court of the demons got mad at him for this and had him executed. I have no idea what's going on with this last story, but it's a part of a giant list of stories from this one rabbi who gives a giant list of some really strange and out there tales, and most of them are explained to be metaphors for certain topics, so just bear that in mind for that one. There is this much simpler story wherein this one rabbi was lured into a study house that a demon had infested by the residents of the town because they wanted him to take care of it. So he slept there and was woken up by a giant horrifying demon with 7 serpent heads. So he bowed down to God 7 times and each demon head fell off. Then he got really annoyed at the townsfolk because apparently he almost died. The longest and main story about demons is a very lengthy one, and I actually have a full video dedicated to it, so I'll just summarize it here. But it's the story of King Solomon and the king of the demons, Ashmedai. Just a quick note, some say that Ashmedai wasn't his name, it was his title, so Ashmedai apparently means king in the demon language, so yeah, that now you know a little bit of demon language, I guess. Anyways, it basically goes that King Solomon sent his servant to track down a special worm that could cut rocks because he decided to build the first temple in Jerusalem out of it, so they decided to trick, capture, and imprison the demon king, which they did, brought it back, questioned it, then proceeded to build the first temple, and then got tricked in return, at which point King Solomon got flung halfway across the world, pretty much. The Demon King took his form and ruled in his stead and caused a bunch of issues, and King Solomon had to go on a whole side quest to reclaim his throne from Ashmedai, which involved him proving that it was actually a demon, and he was the real one because Ashmedai had rooster feet, so that's what was mentioned earlier. It's a whole thing. Very interesting, like I said. This is a very, very short summary, but definitely read the whole thing if it sounds interesting. So yeah, that should give you a pretty general idea as to what we're dealing with here. But how do you deal with them? Well, first of all, they're explained to haunt ruins and dark places where few people go, so first and foremost, avoid those. They also apparently haunt bathrooms for some reason, but yeah, there's also a general principle that's referenced very often, which I'm just gonna refer to as the rule of 3, which is that if there's 3 people, a demon can't appear before you. If there's 2 people, it can appear, but it can't harm you, and if you're by yourself, well, you're gonna have a bad time. This doesn't always strictly apply, however, and there are some situations mentioned where a demon is powerful enough to harm even 2 people. There are also some spells of sorts, you can say. It's more of a prayer, but whatever, to banish a demon. They're pretty long. I'll just write down the source. Please look it up if you're ever concerned about coming across a demon. There's also a spell of sorts where you re-say the demon's name over and over, but each time shorter, which can diminish its power, I guess. So that's also important to be aware of. But yeah, that's broadly speaking enough details on how to deal with one. Also, it says saying the Shema prayer by night is the equivalent of holding, quote, a double-edged sword against anything that would try and harm you, specifically demons, so that's pretty cool. Say Shema, it's important. There's also a very lengthy thing about pairs, as in doubles, that demons are heavily associated with anything done in pairs, and Ashmedai, king of the demons, is associated with doubles very often, so be careful with that too. Although it does say that demons only attack people that are careful with doubles, that mess up with that whole concept, not people who just generally do whatever and happen to accidentally do something in pairs. Okay, but how do I summon a demon? Good question, and there's a very simple guide, which I will read word for word. Although, to be fair, this is less on how to make a demon walk over to you. It's just that as there are literally thousands of demons all around you, this will allow you to see them now, because they're invisible. Okay, here we go. Quote, one who seeks to see them should take the placenta of a firstborn female black cat born to a firstborn female black cat, burn the placenta in a fire, grind it, and then put it in your eyes, and then you'll see them. You should then place the ashes in an iron tube sealed with an iron seal, lest the demons steal it from you, and then seal the opening so that way you won't be harmed. Rav Bevi bar Abaya performed this procedure, saw the demons, and was harmed. The sages prayed for mercy on his behalf, and he was healed. So, don't do this. Never mind that I have no idea where you're getting the necessary requirements for this procedure, and I can assure you it's nowhere good, but it very clearly states not to do this, and if you do, there's gonna be some issues. So yeah, that's that. Pretty concise, pretty simple. Again, do not do this. Okay, that's pretty much everything. So, let's take a step back. What exactly is going on here? Is this, for real? Are demons a fundamental aspect of Judaism that you need to be very worried about? Well, first of all, probably not. It's questionable how much of this was metaphor, literal, somewhere between, and generally speaking, they're not much of a subject that matter too much in Judaism. This whole thing is very selective, and they're really not brought up very often. In fact, pretty much, not at all. I have actually seen some people or sources who want to say that all of this is a pre-scientific metaphor for disease and bacteria, which some of the points lend more credence to, others less. I don't like this one, it's boring. I have seen one or two things that say that some sage or another in centuries past banished them all, which is why they're no longer a thing. Perhaps. Or as the world became less spiritual and we've been in a prolonged exile for several thousand years, the same way God is less visible to our eyes, the same go for all spiritual entities. Perhaps. But there is something we can do for this regard, which is to do our best to make the world a better place in whatever small way, one good deed at a time, to one day bring Mashiach and to turn things back for good to the way they once were to some extent. And with that said, that's the end of this whole thing. I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe learned something new, and with that said, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, have a great night.